The Japanese prisoners of war, the soldiers who would rather die than surrender. War creates prisoners. It always has. From the deserts of North Africa to the frozen cities of the Eastern Front, millions of soldiers laid down their rifles, raised their hands, and accepted that the war was over for them. But in the vast Pacific, under the burning sun, inside jungles that swallowed entire battalions, and on islands drenched in blood, there was one army that broke every rule of war. An army whose soldiers believed that surrender wasn't just defeat. It was the ultimate shame. An army trained to fight until the last breath, the last bullet, the last heartbeat. This was the Imperial Japanese Army. While the rest of the world counted millions of POWs, Japan's number was so small, so shockingly small, that Allied commanders often thought the enemy simply had no prisoners. Not because the Japanese couldn't be captured, but because they refused to live long enough to be captured. Today, you will hear a story rarely told. A story of a mindset forged in centuries of warrior culture. Of battles where entire units chose death over surrender. And of the few, the very few, who broke the unbreakable code and lived to tell the truth. This is the story of Japanese POWs, the men who would rather die than surrender. A Japanese soldier's war began long before he saw a battlefield. It began the moment he put on the uniform. From day one, instructors drilled a single belief into every recruit. Surrender is not an option, death is your duty. This idea came from the ancient Bushido code, the samurai philosophy that valued honor over survival. If a soldier surrendered, he didn't just lose the battle. He lost his dignity, his family's respect, and according to military doctrine, his right to exist. The Imperial Army took this further. A prisoner was considered already dead. Families of POWs were told their sons had died honorably, because admitting they were captured would bring shame to the entire household. So when the moment of truth came, and a Japanese soldier was surrounded with no ammunition, no food, no hope, he didn't raise his hands. He prepared to die. Across the Pacific, Allied forces noticed something terrifying. Japanese units didn't retreat. They didn't break. They didn't surrender. Not at Guadalcanal. Not at Tarawa. Not at Peleliu. Not on the volcanic nightmare of Iwo Jima. In most battles, Japanese forces fought to near extinction. For example, at Tarawa, out of 4,500 Japanese defenders, only 17 were captured alive. At Iwo Jima, with over 21,000 Japanese soldiers entrenched, only 216 survived as prisoners. The rest died in caves, tunnels, bunkers, or in last-second banzai charges meant to kill as many as possible before death. For Allied troops, this was shocking. They weren't fighting an army. They were fighting men who saw death as victory, and surrender as the end of their honor. When ammunition ran low, when food was gone, when hope was lost, the Japanese soldier had one final weapon. The banzai charge. A desperate assault. A human wave rushing into machine gun fire. Not meant to win, but meant to die with honor. Allied veterans described it as one of the most terrifying sights of the war. Hundreds of soldiers running straight into automatic fire. Some shouting prayers. Some holding swords. Some carrying grenades pressed to their chests. To the Japanese, this was not suicide. It was the ultimate act of loyalty. Better to die charging the enemy than live as a prisoner. Something happened that shocked American Marines. A lone Japanese soldier, exhausted, starving, trembling, slowly stepped out of the jungle, with his hands raised. The Marines didn't shoot. They didn't believe what they were seeing. The prisoner was terrified. Not because he feared the Americans, but because he believed his own army would label him a disgrace forever. His testimony later revealed an even darker truth. Japanese soldiers were told that Americans tortured prisoners, skinned them alive, and killed them for sport. None of this was true, but Japanese officers spread these lies to make surrender impossible. That soldier was one of the first Japanese POWs ever taken in the war, contrary to what they had been told. Most Japanese prisoners found that Allied camps treated them far better than they ever expected. They received food, water, medical care, and in many cases, were shocked that their captors didn't execute them. Some POWs even began to question the beliefs they had been raised with. But there were deep psychological scars. Many refused to speak. Some refused to eat. Others believed that surviving as a prisoner meant they had already died spiritually. One American officer wrote, "They weren't afraid of us. They were afraid of going home." There were moments in the Pacific when Japanese soldiers desperately wanted to surrender, but couldn't. Why? Because their officers often executed any soldier who even suggested surrender. In some units, retreat was punishable by death. Cowardice was answered with a bullet. Not from the enemy, but from their own commanders. So even when Japanese troops were starving, disease-ridden, and surrounded, many simply accepted their fate. They would die where they stood. By 1945, the situation became impossible for Japan. Cities were burning. Millions were starving. The Navy was shattered. The Air Force was nearly gone. Yet on islands across the Pacific, small pockets of Japanese soldiers continued fighting, as if the war would last forever. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, many soldiers refused to believe it. Some thought it was Allied propaganda. Some hid for months. Others refused to step out of the jungle until their commanders personally confirmed it. For many of them, surrendering, after years of believing it was dishonorable, was more painful than the war itself. Even after the war ended, even after the emperor himself announced surrender, some soldiers kept fighting. The most famous example was Hiroo Onoda, a Japanese intelligence officer who refused to surrender. For 29 years, he lived in the Philippine jungle, raiding villages, evading patrols, and carrying out missions he believed were still active. He only surrendered in 1974, when his old commander traveled from Japan to personally order him to stop. That's how deep the code of no surrender ran during the entire war. The Allies captured around 35,000 Japanese POWs. These, over 11 million German POWs. The difference is staggering. Japan didn't have fewer prisoners because they were invincible. They had fewer prisoners because their soldiers chose death over capture. The story of Japanese POWs isn't just about war. It's about identity, honor, and the power of belief. These soldiers were not fearless. They were conditioned to think that surrender was worse than any torture the enemy could inflict. Some died following that code. Some broke the code and survived. And some denied the war was over for decades. Today their story remains one of the most haunting chapters of World War II. Because in the Pacific, death was not the enemy, dishonor was. Subscribe now and step deeper into the hidden, untold stories of war.